For today's podcast, we're going to be going on the idea of national emergency declarations and comparing them to the idea of Ferdinand Marcos's national, martial law declaration back in 1972, Proclamation number 1081, which is essentially an executive order, which is what is essentially made as which is what is equal to same scope as a national emergency, to make the case for the situation for the martial law. Now, before this, we're going to get to the idea of asking people to donate to my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/challengehistory to become a patron. Starts at $1, has levels at 10, 25, 50, and 100. 50, there's going to be a future edition of the benefit of where people can add themselves on for giveaway of a silver Roman coin. $100 will be the giveaway for a gold Byzantine coin. The more people add on with it at those levels, the more frequently the giveaway is going to be. And I will eventually add on for the 25, 10, and base levels when I start to get people on those lists. Now to this with it, if you start reading over this, it was just basically a declaration of martial law. Now, for people that actually know what was actually their constitution before this point, it was actually a direct copy of the United States, and basically what it was to control was they was asking for control was Congress, Supreme Court, any type of constitutional convention, City Hall, U.S. Embassy, facilities of U.S. bases, provincial capitals, power plants, PLDT, radio stations, and he was asking for basically control of that, and he was going from starting from different points, and this was basically to go at it, and he was saying this against these things because there was a potential of a constitutional convention because of they wanted to add amendments and actually rewrite their constitution, and he used this as an actual base. They ended up rewriting the constitution back in 1987 after they end up ousting him, and this ended up being a point. Now, what ended up happening was they ousted him, and this ended up happening, and he ended up using some of the basis of his point was basically he was doing it on fear of Marxism within some of the bases. Well, those weren't necessarily all the people that were actually against him. It wasn't them. It wasn't really them. They weren't really a sizable force. If we actually look at it. Now, it tends to usually be fear-mongering that ends up being the reason why they try to use these points. Now, there's usually legitimate solutions to these things that end up being why they end up using these declarations. And it is not usually based upon legitimate arguments. He was using the points of the Muslim groups who were essentially radicalized, which they and the others with it. But the fact is, when it came down to the People's Party Revolution, which ended up going against him and removing him. They basically, most of these people were actually behind the leader that his group had assassinated, which was Benito Aquino Jr. Now, Benito Aquino Jr. was neither Marxist nor a Muslim. He was a Catholic, and he believed full-heartedly in the ideas of capitalism. And this is what needs to be understood. Now, when we apply this to what we see with national emergencies, doesn't matter if we're talking about Trump's wall, because Trump's wall with it, not only was he asking it to be considered a national emergency, which would have been fine, but the fact is he was asking for appropriation, which was not lawful. And that's where we get to things like this, where you're going beyond the actual realm of what would be considered a national emergency. You can declare something a national emergency at the border, but then you have to compel them if you need appropriations, or appropriations rerouted, and they can essentially adjust it for that, but he never actually made a compelling case. And once they and he's never made this compelling case, and that's why when they voted against it. He can veto it all he wants, but this means that there is no legitimacy to it. Now, he can request appropriations within the next budget, but that does not. That would essentially override the actual national emergency. He might as well retract the national emergency as is, which means that there is no emergency per se, and he might as well retract it. This is why when people use these national emergencies, they need to really think about what they're doing. And you're essentially trying to usurp Congress's authority, and that's the whole point. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to use this to usurp the authority of a group below, and you're not doing it with you're doing it without compelling them at all, and that's where the whole problem comes from. And it could be for almost any reason when you start concentrating the power up in the executive. And that's the whole problem. That's what Ferdinand Marcos was doing. Now, that was a definite case of abuse of power, and it's if you look at the case of him and Imelda Marcos, it mimics very similar to cases of Barack and Michelle Obama, as well as if you look at Benjamin Netanyahu, and I forgot the name of his wife. His wife is Sarah Ben Artsy, and she's the other one as well. She's and it mimics pretty much identically with that. Not saying that Trump is on that line, because he's not using his position for graft like those two families have, and have tried to use have tried to claim that they can use executive orders to violate the Constitution of their countries, to essentially use it for graft. Like Obama used it to essentially supersede the immigration law with DACA, and allowed that to basically just be that wasn't even an executive order. It was actually just a memo from Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano. That's not essentially even a legal document. That's just a memo. And they're essentially allowing that to essentially stand in court these days, which it should just be thrown right out, because it's nothing more than a memo. And that's what DACA is. It's a deferred action for childhood arrivals. And it's nothing more than a memo. And it's it should be basically thrown out, and any of those people under that should essentially have no legal status, because it wasn't essentially a legal document to begin with. Now, when we see Benjamin Netanyahu, he's been threatening journalists who don't follow the state line with it, and this has basically been the case. And being that they're virtually a socialist country, they get funding a little bit out of the ordinary system. But this is basically what they do, is just like any other socialist or communist country, they make sure that the media follows a certain standard. Well, there's been because of the internet, you have some pieces of the media that have not followed that standard, and he's harassed them. And he's basically tried to block people from putting up negative media on him. And if you look at, there's certain media outlets that are essentially they're actually all they are basically state propaganda, no different than coming out of China or what came out of the Soviet Union back when the Soviet Union existed. And that's basically what you are seeing, and that's the case. What's coming out of there, and anybody taking any of their pieces as being serious has got a serious problem on their hands. Now, when we go back to this is why these can be very, very dangerous, because in the United States we have multiple parties that are flipping back and forth. And if you do not actually have any type of serious reform on this, what ends up happening is, because we have certain aspects of parties being right and left that don't exactly believe in the Constitution as it was written, and as we went over yesterday night with the idea of our of how many of the members, regardless of party, don't have a 90+ rating on following the actual Constitution. This is just from the people sworn into the legislature. So they don't even have up to a 90%. And that means there's a serious problem. And that means we're talking that there's people out there that are basically going to they're going to go through and take your rights away. And that's a major issue. And when it comes down to it, is they're going to vote against the Constitution. And that's going to basically, you'll have the right, there's people on the right that are going to go against the idea of basically freedom of privacy, and you're going to have the left that are going to go that have now decided they don't like freedom of speech for everyone, and both sides are a lot of times going in all in on a war, which is without allowing an actual basically declaration of war. And you'll see them basically go through one by one and just eviscerate the actual Constitution on both sides. So you find very, very low scores. So when we're talking about this, is they're not exactly going to be the best stewards on either side. So this is why when we get national emergencies, you know that they're not going to be in the best interest of the people, because they're just going to be, hey, let's take the people's rights. Well, that's the whole point of where we have issues. And we don't have any civil liberties organizations in the country that actually seriously look at people's civil liberties. The ACLU does not look at people's civil liberties. They're a joke. Anybody considering that is actually not even considering anything realistically. They're basically only going to consider one aspect of the political spectrum. I mean, they've made their decision of which political party they work for, and they're not actually looking out for people's civil liberties at all. Meaning they should be defending the Constitution 100%, and they're not. and they should wanted to oust them. Now you'll have ones that have actually, like JBS defends the Constitution, but they only have so much of an impact, and they've been badmouthed for actually defending the Constitution, and this is by both sides, and that's why we have such low scores. And we only have basically what I found was maybe 5 people who have a 90+% score, and that's pathetic. And this is why when we're talking about this is you can get a martial law with it. We had a previous president try to declare martial law in the Philippines himself. And that's why, well, you had their president, Duterte, try to actually call him some names that I cannot say on this channel because it will basically be flagged for the if I try to translate this stuff over, and I'm not going to try and say it in Tagalog, because the fact is it'll probably be flagged for that as well. But let's just say it's definitely in George Carlin's 7 words bit. And that's what he called President Obama. Because you don't get to declare martial law in someone else's country. And especially when they had their most disliked leader declare martial law, and that's why they ousted him and established a new constitution. They wanted to essentially reestablish their constitutional liberties in a stronger mentality. This is basically why they did it. It was actually Marcos who was actually trying to undermine them. And they were trying, and his excuses was Marcos's excuses were pathetic when we start to look at it. And when we look at Ferdinand Marcos, it was just pathetic when he did this, and he essentially declared himself at this. When you declare martial law, you're suspending elections, which means you're declaring yourself president for life. So when he made the thing that he was trying to seek protection of their constitutional liberties, that is in the actual document, that's actually laughable, because he was only trying to essentially establish himself as president for life, which would be exactly what they do in Marxist, Leninist, Maoist teachings that he was essentially, quote, talking against. So, which is actually hilarious. Because it shows that he was essentially going right into it, and it shows what he was doing. That was September 21st, 1972, and it was by 87 that they actually were able to do this. But it's still, his people were still not gone by his people and supporters have still not been were still not gone by the point of even 87. They still were lingering around even up to the middle 90s. Because they were still causing terrorist attacks within this, because they were mad that he was ousted. Even up to middle 90s, they were launching off pipe bombs. So as much for the thing of them not wanting unrest within the area, they were actually the ones causing the unrest. It was because the fact is he didn't want to be removed, and he felt that was he felt that him being removed was too big, and he realized that he could not have any more graft, him and his wife. And that was the whole thing. Now, when we look at our own country, with us having people that run for office that do not follow the Constitution, anything can be declared as an emergency. You could say gun crime's an emergency, so we need to basically declare that as an emergency, so the Second Amendment is then therefore suspended, which means we need gun confiscation immediately. based on what if you validate the idea that you could reappropriate money without the House of Representatives, which is in the Constitution itself, you can essentially validate the point that the Constitution doesn't really mean anything when a national emergency is declared. And this essentially, if you could validate the point that a national emergency supersedes the Constitution, a national emergency can be declared for anything, and it means the same thing as the martial law, and it just means martial law on a smaller scale, and that's what essentially could mean. And if that's the point, then we know that this is something in which we should be very careful with, and we might as well basically declare either A, the limitations to it on a scale, or B, we should do away with the declarations of national emergencies to begin with, and make it being done through congressional action itself. Either A, they declare something as a national emergency, or B, they don't. Because you could have anything. I mean, if the border was such a national emergency, I mean, Trump would have put it through the budget a long time ago. That shows you right there that it's not so much of a national emergency. How is this such a national emergency? And this is why we have the whole thing with it, why it's a sham, why people tend to declare things as national emergencies. You can declare anything a national emergency. You could say hate speech is a national emergency, and say the First Amendment, your right to free speech is no longer valid anymore. You can say because there was a shooting in a church in New Zealand, the right to freedom of religion is no longer a right. It's now a privilege, and you have to get your right to attend a church card from the government, and it can be revoked at any time. And you're going to declare a national emergency on religious freedom, and you're going to and they can go down the list. You can declare a national emergency on pretty much they've declared a national emergency on terrorism, which is why you don't have Fourth Amendment rights. They didn't even have to do that; they just usurped it. And not many people actually fight against it. There's only a handful of people who actually do. And that this is why we have these problems. We have a handful of people who actually fight for the actual right of sound monetary policy, which was actually constitutional. We're not supposed to have paper money. Paper money is considered to be counterfeit, regardless of who prints it. We're actually supposed to have money supposed to be coined, and it's supposed to be coined by the Constitution, by Congress, not anybody else. You're not supposed to, essentially, the idea of anybody else controlling it is not following the Constitution, and you can't. Congress is supposed to follow that, and if you do not address that point in any amendment, the amendment is essentially invalid. Even if you pass an amendment, if the amendment does not address that point, those amendments are essentially null and void, and they mean nothing. They're basically nothing but a bunch of words, which is why even if you have a central bank, their actions are basically powerless without the control of the Congress, and that means we still should to this day have basically our money should be made out of silver and gold. There's never been an actual congressional amendment to amend that. And that's the whole point. And it says it should be coined. That means basic coins are metal only. You've never heard of any paper coins before. And a paper currency is not a coin. A coin is actually a round that's actually been sanctioned by the actual federal government. That's the difference between a round and a coin. And that's why when we're talking about these things, we need to understand that's why national emergencies are basically a point to where they can be declared for anything, and you don't even have to have a valid reason. The moment you attach national emergency on it, you could essentially usurp the Constitution. And if we declare that, and as I've discussed with people, if we declare that a national emergency could supersede the Constitution just because we declare that a national emergency has this right just because the Constitution, just because the people in Congress wrote a law, that doesn't mean and if we declare that law as being superior to the Constitution, that means essentially anytime someone writes a national emergency or martial law, that means basically that the Constitution doesn't mean anything. That means basically you say, with it, I'm not getting what I want out of this Congress, so I'm just going to keep declaring everything as a national emergency. I'm just going to write everything as a national emergency. And I can just go right around Congress. I don't even have to deal with them. Basically, they're completely powerless. Well, the fact is that's not the way that the Constitution was written. But the fact is we can declare anything with it. You can declare, they won't let me go to war in this one country. Okay, national emergency. They won't let me go around them for this thing on immigration. National emergency. And that's the whole problem. And that's what needs to be understood. And that's essentially why we should be very, very wary. Or basically banning something that's a substance or going around regardless of what it is. That's why we have the Constitution itself. Because the fact is, otherwise you have essentially a tyrannical government, because they can basically just go around and do whatever the hell they want. And otherwise, basically, you could just just have a king if they can declare a national emergency on anything, and the courts couldn't do anything essentially because they declared national emergency or martial law. And if that's the case, then what is the actual point of the Constitution? Then we do not even have an actual nation. And that's where that's why when we look at history with it, we need to understand that the idea of it is the Constitution to be the Constitution Declaration of Independence should be our actual superior documents over anything. And if a law is not consistent with that, it is not a valid law. And that's the whole point. If they're inconsistent with those, they're not legitimate. And this is why we look to these other points in history. This is why we go over to the Philippines with this one, because we look at what Marcos did, and the fact is they ousted him. And we look to what the people did when the government was tyrannical. They threw the guy's butt out of office when the government became tyrannical. And this is the same thing any people can do. When the government becomes tyrannical, throw their butts out of office. Physically. They got out there in the streets and they did it. And it wasn't just one group with it. It wasn't just the capitalists doing it out there in the streets and the Marxists going, we're not going to participate, which is equal to our Democratic Party. Because our Democratic Party is frankly just Marxist now. It wasn't like that with it. No, it was everybody. They realized if they wanted their government back, and if they wanted the actual legitimate right to have a democratic republic and have fair rights to actually decide the scope of where they wanted their country to go, they needed to work together. So they worked together to basically throw these unconstitutional bums out of office. And that's how they did it. So you had the same thing. You had people equal to Antifa and these far left-wing nut jobs working equal side to people that would be like the Tea Party. and they were working together to throw these people out of office. And the fact is that's the way it went. And they embraced people that were very, very similar to like Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Justin Amash, Thomas Massey. They embraced people like that because they knew even if it wasn't their ideal form of it, they knew people like that would actually bring their system forward and reestablish the way it was meant to be. And they would basically throw them out with it. And then they know that anytime there's a problem with it, they will basically, their butts are out in the streets protesting. Regardless of what side there is, when the moment they see something tyrannical happening, their butts are out in the street protesting. They're not just protesting because they're getting paid by some support group. This is not what they're doing. They're not basically pawns of George Soros or any of this other garbage like that. They're actually out there in the streets protesting. You could you'll pretty much see that happening constantly. They're actually out there. They want to make their system better. And that's why when they get here with it, when they see something wrong happening, they're doing the same thing here. And you'll actually see if we actually adopt what they're actually doing out there, you'll see actually a system, if we actually copied what they were doing and actually be politically active and not just basically sit back and basically listen to what we're told to believe and basically go out there and basically be fanboys of this group or that group and basically say, hey, this guy's paying me $30 to basically throw bricks through buildings and to cause a bunch of chaos and to basically say these certain things and hold these signs up. And no, these groups such as Black Lives Matter, such as the Women's March, they're all fake. Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, that $15 an hour group for minimum wage. These are all basically groups funded by George Soros, the Impeach Trump groups. It's all fake stuff funded by people like Soros because they want to basically create division. Instead, we actually need to get people out there who are actually true grassroots people, not these fake groups out there that are basically reading off of a script. You see these people in DC with it just reading off of a script. They're basically saying what to say, and they're saying it like lemmings. Yeah, that's what you want. People saying it like lemmings. That's not what you actually want. You want people actually out there that are real, true activists, and you want to actually get back to the spirit that we had back when this country was founded. And they have it out there. We don't have it here. And the reason is because we don't have people here that are actually volunteering into like the city halls and understand about local government. No, we have people here making selfies, basically doing these shot glass photo challenges, like the Kylie Jenner challenge or whatever the hell garbage it is. We're doing these little things of let's eat Tide Pods. We're doing these stupid challenges of basically trying to half kill ourselves, and this is what's going on. And we're completely and utter morons. While they're basically running to the bank and eviscerating every single one of our rights, and we're basically saying, "Hey, how can we help you along?" That's what basically we get from these people like David Hogg and other morons like that. They're basically all they are just more morons that are willing to jump in line. It's just more fodder for the actual system. Instead of actually saying we want our rights and we're not going to rescind them and we're not going to give up until we get them all back, and that's what needs to happen. And when we basically act as fodder and say, hey, just declare a national emergency. Then the next side goes, we're going to declare a national emergency. Then they go back, more national emergencies, more national emergencies, more national emergencies. Hey, this means that I can go to war over nothing. And guess what? We're basically in a complete and utter sham of an actual country, and no one has any rights, and the executive is the king, and we're back to the actual square one, and we have no actual country. And this is why we do this. And this is why we start talking about actual history and actually giving the real history of what actually happens, because the fact is when we declare martial law, that means you have no rights. And if we look actually at history, it doesn't matter if we look at our history or history of other countries that are very, very closely related to us or even not closely related to us, we need to understand what goes on. And it doesn't matter if it's modern or far back with it, this is the real history of what actually happens. And we need to understand this, because the fact is we're just basically being steamrolled when it comes down to our rights being taken away. And we shouldn't tolerate it all, and we shouldn't say, hey, Trump is trying to do the best for us. No, Trump has no idea what he's doing. He is completely green when it comes to the actual government. He's listening to neoconservatives that are basically running roughshod over him. The only time where he does anything good is when he listens to Rand Paul. That's the only thing where he does anything good. Why does he do good when he listens to Rand Paul? Look at Rand Paul's rating for following the Constitution. He has a career rating of 94%. When you have a rating that high, you're going to essentially be doing good for the country. You look at when he listens to these neocons with it, most of the neocons are lucky to have ratings in the 50% or lower. This means they're basically flipping a coin of whose rights you're going to be taking away. Now, if you like this video, like and subscribe, click the notification bell, make sure you share it all the way around with your friends and share it publicly. Check out my Patreon page, and you'll see a story about the basis of where I'm coming from with it. And make sure that if you can't donate, share it with somebody else who can. And that's about it for the video, and I will hit you guys later for my nightly stream. And bye, everyone.